Welcome to FYI, the For-Your Innovation podcast. This show offers an intellectual discussion on technologically enabled disruption, because investing in innovation starts with understanding it. To learn more, visit arc-invest.com.
ARC Invest is a registered investment advisor focused on investing in disruptive innovation. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for investment decisions. It does not constitute, either explicitly or implicitly, any provision of services or products by ARC. All statements made regarding companies or securities are strictly beliefs and points of view held by ARC or podcast guests and are not endorsements or recommendations by ARC to buy, sell, or hold any security. Clients of ARC Investment Management may maintain positions in the securities discussed in this podcast.
From ARC Invest, this is the FYI For Your Innovation podcast. I'm Brett Winton. Welcome. We have a great show for you today. We have Charlie Roberts, Nemo Despot, and we're talking to Geoff von Maltzahn, who is the CEO of Lila, a company just out of stealth that is aiming to apply AI to revolutionize and accelerate science across domains. Nemo, we invested in Lila. What did you see about Lila that caused us to kind of pursue the opportunity, and what is it that they're seeking to achieve?
Yeah, so as someone who spent 10 years in science at MIT, did my PhD and everything, I saw that how today's science is very slow. It's really stochastic. There is no really compounding effect. It's a really delayed compounding effect. What really drew me to Lila is that Lila, it's not only trying to industrialize the science, but they're really trying to enable autonomous science. So where AI is actually driving the experiments and exploring the search space. So if you think about the science, science is a kind of broad term, and science is basically a method for us to kind of making, showing that hypothesis is working or not. But basically, it's actually as a problem, it's a search problem where you have certain constraints. And so what Lila is trying to do, combine the AI, especially the generative AI, with automation in laboratories, and then apply that across different scientific fields to basically enable truly autonomous scientific discovery, which then can actually help us explore this huge search space faster and actually help us kind of bring the future sooner to us than later. Let's say like that.
Yeah, I think that they are creating both the proprietary data engine in their autonomous labs, tying that to an AI-driven model, which should, improve. Like it should get better at material science as it gets better at biological science, as it gets better at kind of the chemical science side, and that's what differentiates it from some of the other AI exposures that we've taken in the multiomic space, where they are more going directly after, drug discovery in particular. Lila has an audacious mission and really an inspiring leader, and it really is a unique company out there. Steve Jurvetson has said, they look for companies that are doing something different from how other companies are doing it. I think Lila definitely falls into that category. And so enjoy the conversation with Geoff. And yeah, hopefully it's leading to a future where the rate of scientific advance accelerates.
Exponentially.
Geoff von Maltzahn, welcome to FYI, the For Your Innovation podcast. So Lila, your business that you are CEO and founder of, has just come out of stealth. Tell us what it is and why we should be doing science autonomously in this new age of artificial intelligence.
Cool, Brett. Thank you for having me. Excited to talk to you guys about this. I'll start with Lila's mission. Our mission is to build scientific superintelligence to solve humankind's greatest challenges. That is, of course, a lofty mission, but we realized in years of thinking about this that we would be deciding consciously or subconsciously to work on something less important than what was evidently in front of the field. If you know the Hamming questions, who in Bell Labs era would ask people, what are the most important problems in your field? What do you work on? And then if the answer to the second one was different from the first, why the hell is the answer to question 2 distinct from question 1. This, we believe, is the most important moment, arguably, in the history of science. And you could have 2 simple philosophies for where AI science goes from here. One is that a sufficient scale and sophistication of AI model trained on the internet will bring science to an end, i.e., everything will be known, no experiments will ever need to be run, every disease will be cured instantaneously, every ecosystem modelable, every material that's never been seen or touched will be understood. We believe the probability of that is effectively 0. And that paradigm 2 is that AI models trained on publicly available data will unleash avalanche after avalanche of similarly plausible hypotheses that are going to have to be ground truthed in a lab to distinguish fact from fiction. In that world, we believe all competitive advantage in science is going to flow to whomever can run the most brilliant next experiment with the highest intelligence, largest scale, and fastest speed. And to maximize those parameters, the intelligence, scale, and speed of brilliant science, we believe you have to solve a whole bunch of hard problems to allow AI models to play the game of science themselves.
Yeah, it's kind of like, the large AI models today have been trained on effectively all of the, available language tokens in the internet, including all kinds of scientific papers. And people have been concerned about, well, actually, we're running out of data. And so the Lila approach is, hey, equip the system with a reasoning engine that can then extract the data it needs to get to the next insight across multiple domains, and therefore push the needle through the frontier of science into that next innovation or discovery. Do it in an autonomous or automated way that extends across fields of science, and you can accelerate the underlying rate of scientific discovery. That's my understanding.
Beautifully said. In fact, the process you just described could be thought of as the most valuable wheel that humankind has ever created. It is the wheel that led to every wheel and effectively every technology around us. We call it the scientific method. And whether it was Newton with an apple falling on his head, or like me trying to find my keys in the morning, or me as a grad student at MIT, or anybody in any scientific venue, those steps are in common. And what Lila's trying to do is effectively reinvent that most valuable wheel by creating an AI model and system that can autonomously conduct every step in the scientific method so as to bring the scale, intelligence, and speed of science way up.
How much, Jeff, do you have to... this gets, I suppose, pretty quickly into a kind of the raging debate, maybe still, around to what extent models... you have sort of determinism in models, symbolic AI versus everything being learned. To what extent do you have to teach the kind of models you envisage and you're building at Lila with things like scientific method? Do you pre-code that in, or do you even allow that to be learned? Because just as agents can learn languages that humans don't even understand, and we've already got some evidence of that, maybe there's a next-gen concept or working of the scientific method itself that might really deliver, and a machine could learn in a way that a human would never have been able to educate it.
Yeah, there's a bunch of wonderful forays embedded in that. So at some point, if the universe is of finite complexity, science becomes deterministic, and all those things I described at the beginning will be known. That is not going to be from all Bill Nye the Science Guy videos and every high-quality data set of science thus far. Even back of the envelope, simple assessments of how many experiments did Mother Nature ever run in every category of biomolecules that makes life possible puts all of that at less than 1 drop of water versus all of the Earth's oceans of combinatorial possibilities. So the en route to that, one could take multiple paths in the paradigm that Lila's creating. The essence of what we're setting in motion is the strategy that has led to superintelligence in chess, Go, and other regimes, which is not to just train models based on Kasparov's best chess games and the equivalent in Go. Such models do not become superintelligent. when you let them play the game themselves, they become vastly so. So effectively, we're letting AI models play the game or many games of science autonomously. The but is that the minimal conditions would be to only provide the ground rules and let AI models stumble through every mistake that human knowledge and intuition has worked our way through. That is a slow start to such a paradigm. So instead, you can think about Lila's strategy as benefiting immensely from the sort of internet into an LLM paradigms that others have pioneered. And whatever that intelligence is at any point in time, our aspiration is that the reasoning models that we're creating, the other generative tools, and the paradigm of autonomous science and the scale of proprietary data and brilliant experimentation that we can set in motion make Lila's scientific intelligence the public domain leader plus the intelligence derived from each of those investments.
How do you kind of think about importance of the proprietary experimentation for actually kind of making the models better over the time?
Yeah, so I'll elaborate on the mental model for AI models in the public domain. Those will do increasingly extraordinary things. They will also fall short of science becoming deterministic. While those advances are going to be meaningful, we believe they're also going to be very difficult to maintain a proprietary advantage around. For the simple reason that if it's all public data, all a competitor has to do is hire one person that knows the secret for how to build the model with which to recapitulate a varying capability. And, we're obviously seeing that with the foundation model pioneers being neck and neck on any given moment. So proprietary data simplistically is one of the only moats that will reside, in our view, here forward. But all data is not created equal. Going back to Newton, he didn't need a data lake. And, for 10 plus years in science, people have been using terms like that. And it's kind of felt like an admission that nobody knows what to do with it or that we don't know what's valuable. So we just, count sort of total data points. Instead, like Newton, it will be the brilliance with which hypotheses are ground truthed that will define the value of proprietary data. Like going back to the analogy to chess and Go, random game simulations is far worse from the perspective of mastering the game than playing the game with increasing intelligence with every round.
Well, from an architecture perspective, like at least as you describe it, it's like there are LLMs which are generally useful. You can, on top of that, probably layer, some kind of memory store or like higher quality data that you're relying on, maybe in the particular domain that you're in, or maybe generally across science. Then you can build kind of a reasoning engine on top of it, which is what's happening both in the open source side and with OpenAI. And actually all the frontier models now in terms of like, how do you take this pre-trained model and make it smarter at making kind of reasonable running runtime compute to establish reasonable chains of logic to where they're trying to go. And then part of Lila's secret sauce is maybe the reasoning engine and the data store, and then equipping that reasoning engine with a mechanism by which it can reason across real-time experimentation to get proprietary data. I mean, it makes a ton of sense. And executionally, it seems quite challenging. You have to kind of build out these, tools to generate the data for you. How do you think about that in terms of like taking capital, turning it into kind of data generation engines for yourself, and in what domains are you going to try to do it?
Yeah, you can think about the paradigm of autonomous science and the autonomous labs that we are inventing and building as a means by which to create the largest scale verifier for scientific reasoning models. As you all know, the reason that AI models are becoming so good at math and software is that by definition, you can effectively trust that training sets, in the case of software, compile and work or in the case of mathematical problems, have been accurately solved. Furthermore, you can compile and assess or compute any given suggestion for coming from an AI model. That doesn't exist in science. So as you stray from the probabilistic highest, most likely next token, which is kind of like recapitulating scientific dogma, meaning it's going to have all of the constraints of the consensus opinion, there will need to be a means by which to distinguish fact and fiction. And the paradigm of autonomous science, we believe, will be the first generalizable, scalable means by which to do that. So the but is that it's really hard. In order to allow really dynamic science to be autonomous, you have to solve a set of things that have not been solved inside of a scientific lab before. One of the challenges in the world of industrial or automated science is that it isn't very useful on the frontiers of science. The simple rationale has been that those paradigms are really good when you want to run the same experiment 10,000 times in a row, but you almost never want to do that on the frontiers. You have to change the hypotheses and often the experiment in ensuing cycles. And therefore, to date, the frontiers of science have been occupied by human hands and mind. And what we've set in motion in what we've called AI science factories, for which we're building 7 this year, is what we think about as like a Wright brothers moment in science. Like science has been on the terrain I just described, and this allows it to elevate into what could be a higher intelligence, is a higher level of scalability, higher fidelity, and faster speed. And those advantages we think are going to beget new scaling laws for scientific intelligence. But it requires solving the challenges at the level of AI, architectures, software, and hardware to do so. So when we define this mission, it is not a mission accomplished. It is the perspective that those are among the very most worthwhile and inspiring challenges that we could work on.
Yeah, just to double click on maybe one of those things. This ties in very nicely to some research work we've been doing looking at agentic systems and maybe the desiderata of success in agentic systems, and where, the default assumption might be that you get sort of uniform progress in a lot of agentic settings. And I think to your point, that's exactly not what will happen. In fact, what will happen is driven by certain desiderata, particularly things like, do you have a hard endpoint that can read out something like a unit test in code generation where you get a hard pass-fail, and you can run that pass-fail in a highly automated, rapid, and cheap way. So you get a lot of iteration cycles. I think that's exactly how you're thinking about it too. Probably other desiderata are of likelihood of agentic success would be things like, how many steps do you have to do from point A to point B to get to if point B is that readout? Because if obviously combinatorial complexity blows up extremely quickly in the number of steps. And then what is the vocabulary of steps you can take at each position? Is it 2 or is it 100,000? Like that also makes a big difference. And obviously with robotics, this comes up a lot, this kind of thing. And then another big thing is, how robust is the system to a hallucination? And what's your risk benefit sort of trade-off with every step taken? Obviously very different in fintech or nuclear, say, than what I like about science is actually we're very hallucinatory tolerant in a way because we can validate, but also because most scientific hypothesis generation is kind of hallucination yet to be proven, right? And we've had so many sort of missteps and things that have still led to great outcomes because, you can have 1 in 100 hit rate and it's still we make progress, although it's slow and painful. But my question to you is, as you think about that, do you go more towards the, with all of the amazing capital, and we can talk about the round you've done to the extent you can share, and firepower and the advantage you have here, do you go for those very hard things that become very hard to do and will be even harder for others with this sort of moat? Or do you go for, I'm going to call it the low-hanging fruit, even though it's far from that, right? Where it might be easier to close the loop. So it's not probably as easy as code generation, but maybe there's something you can do in the lab which can close the loop relatively, you can conceptualize how you would even do that, right? And you can decide, I don't know, if it's a material that actually does what it says on the tin or whatever it is. Do you go for those low-hanging fruits, or do you go for the really hard things that even with all that you have, you're struggling to think, how would we even pull this experiment off? And then others following behind you are going to be even further behind. Or do you sort of hedge your bets and go for a combination of those and have a sort of a portfolio approach? And any commentary on that would be very helpful to understand.
Yeah, let me set the stage with two perspectives that make the typical "where does one start" question actually quite difficult for Lila. One is the if you look at the way the science is done today, the human hands and minds approach, it's really laborious. And as opposed to that training on software code that compiles and works, if you pick a random Nature paper and as an aspiring scientist want to repeat it, that can take a year, or longer. There's mysterious steps that are left out or, accidental omissions. And so the default for all scientific literature is that it does not compile and work. You have to work your way through, gaining the intuition and understanding the steps that were never written down. We believe something like 100% of that goes away during the period of time that it takes any therapeutic company with a development candidate to get to market on the other side of clinical trials, which can take 10 years. I.e., on the other side of that, science is going to be operating at a very different level of intelligence, and we believe at grand, expansive scale. Because unless there's a desert sitting in the future of science, if the ROI of science goes way up, then the scale of science goes up. And if the scale of science dictates the intelligence of science, then the sort of infrastructure that we're creating is going to vastly expand science. And by the way, make it way more fun for those of us in the field. I'll add one more, which is we realized early in Lila that when you pose the challenges you have to solve to turn any subset of science into autonomous science, the generalized version of that problem statement overlaps with almost all of science. What that means is that one can amortize a very aggressive investment at creating autonomous science against the potential reward of all of science. So under one roof in Lila, we have been applying our system to material science, chemistry, and life science. And I'll give you some examples of starting points. We wanted to start in places that are going to be valuable, which have a fast and valuable experimental loop that can be run, and which would open up much larger categories of opportunities that are adjacent to specific demonstrations. And one of members of our founding team, his name is Chris Fussell. He wrote a New York Times bestseller called Team of Teams with Stanley McChrystal about their time in the Special Forces and SEAL Team 6. And one of the things we were trying to test is whether that operational model of small teams with maximum velocity of decision-making could keep up with the breadth of a scientific AI platform. So I'll give you two examples. One is in the realm of mRNA. We had 3 non-mRNA experts inside of Lila aspire to start from scratch and without knowing the Moderna or BioNTech COVID vaccine designs, apply autonomous science to discover sequences that would be higher performing than either of those. They wanted to do that in less than 6 months. The pioneers of mRNA technology had a decade and $1 billion+ of investment into their science to be ready for the pandemic. So 3 non-experts doing so in 6 months seemed unlikely. 4 months later, they had successfully done that by more than 3x, measured with the most important unit for any mRNA, which is how many molecules of protein are produced per molecule of mRNA that is provided. And in fact, what the AI had discovered was mRNA sequences whose ends, the untranslated regions, look really different from human-designed or nature's solutions. Like a mini Move 37 of the AI figuring out a decisive strategy that human minds hadn't been able to touch. I'll give you another one in materials, which is even if we can electrify the whole world, there will still be major industries that want to burn something. Electrolysis and green hydrogen, splitting water into hydrogen and oxygen, could be a viable solution. However, it is expensive today. And one of the reasons is that the rate limiting step is driven by electrodes that are composed of platinum group metals and iridium. Platinum group metals and iridium are scarce and expensive. We had two scientists want to apply autonomous science to discover Earth-abundant electrode compositions that could be 1,000 times less expensive and comparably performing. We had an MIT professor and a Caltech professor closely advising us, implore them not to work on that. They believed it was important, but there are 100-ish labs around the world that work on that, and they expected it would take a decade for one of those groups to discover something of that kind. Within 4 months, almost every 2 weeks, the team started spitting out a new composition that was composed of distinct elements on the periodic table and 1,000 to 5,000 times less expensive and comparably performing. The Caltech and MIT professor have decided to join us full time, in part based on the inference that this platform is going to make science a lot more fun. So those we believe are indicative of larger categories being able to turn over. And we have about a half dozen instantiations where small teams have been able to do something like break a world record using even early versions of the Lila platform.
Why do different categories of science? As in, you can imagine upstream, you get to potential super provocative results as you've detailed. Downstream of that, you have to figure out a way to monetize it, to re-energize your cash, to reinvest in kind of like the underarching platform. It would seem like, or I would say the standard playbook would be like, okay, we're going to go after therapeutics and we're going to sign like collaborative deals with like the big pharma ones. And we'll just kind of like reinvest in that therapeutics platform. Then we have our experts working on that. And then that's the direction we would go. Why even bother with materials or chemistry? Why not just go that kind of like standard route?
Yeah, we believe the conventional scientific business model, which you just described really well, will be ill-suited to winning the most important race in the history of science, which is achieving and leading in scientific superintelligence. For the simple reason that you can only rationalize so much investment into a platform and scale if the dividend is 1 therapeutic, 3 therapeutics, 10 therapeutics, and if those therapeutics are a decade away from their first revenue, or the equivalent of that in facets of the world of materials. If we're right with the Lila thesis, then all of science is sitting in the bitter lesson right now. You all, of course, know that. Your listeners may or not be familiar with a piece by Rich Sutton, which has gained a lot of popularity because he wrote it in 2019, and it's been so objectively, empirically correct since. He observed that in the 60 years of AI research leading up to that point, every time a strategy was taken that was customized to the way that humans have defined a good strategy or a problem, whether it's what a good chess move looks like or a bird's beak in an image, those approaches got destroyed by generalizable, scalable ones. So when I say all of science is sitting in the bitter lesson, to us, it feels very different to have spent 20 years specializing in designing an mRNA or an electrocatalyst or a carbon capture scaffold or a small molecule for oncology applications. But when AI gets to run the wheel of science, those domains may be much more overlapping than they are distinct. And we believe that the much more valuable feat than any individual product will be leading the world in scientific superintelligence. That is what distinguishes our science from the rest of the animal kingdom. So intelligence going up should not be underestimated.
So, but if we take the kind of idea, right, that, science is basically ultimately a search problem, right? Like all science is. And so from that kind of perspective, I can see that actually kind of not pigeoning yourself to a particular kind of niche is actually better. But more on the kind of, where I'm kind of interested more on the practical end, right, of the experimentation. And you mentioned that you're kind of, building these kind of scientific AI factories. But how do you overcome, given the specialization in different kind of fields, the need for the experimentation and the kind of proprietary data across these different fields? And how do you prioritize there? Where do you want to kind of start?
Yeah. So let me get to the point of meaningful distinction, which is an AI science factory for life science and material science obviously look very different. Think of an AI science factory as manufacturing two things that have not been manufacturable before. Novel scientific knowledge, and the more important one, which is scientific intelligence itself. And a life science AI science factory could be thought of as the instruments that you might buy if you were starting a life science department at MIT. The material science one, the comparable material science department, but interconnected with novel hardware, robotics, and automation, with an overlay of new software and with an AI model on top, enabling the conduct of AI-driven experiments to be done semi or fully autonomously. So the instrumentation is distinct, and that will evolve. Like if you think of science's progression to this faraway destination of determinism, the last lab that's running experiments won't look anything like a lab today. It won't have a single instrument in common. So we're building these systems with the intention for them to be scalable, modular, dynamically rearrangeable, and then for AI updates and software updates with common hardware to allow continuous improvements in the kind of science that we're doing.
How do you think about setting up the objective function, Jeff, to get to something like that? Like obviously you've got to start somewhere, right? The journey of more than 1,000 miles begins with a step. You've got to have an objective function that works for now, and then that's going to age out, and then at some point the scientific AI factory will be setting its own objective function. Obviously, we can talk about the kind of the paperclip hypothesis or whatever, but presumably at some point you want to get to AI factories that build other AI factories, maybe at some scale. Like, how do you think about that journey of the objective function? I guess is just one thing, and like how far ahead can you even begin to think about that? Like, how far ahead are you planning? Is that like a normal startup, or is it very much shorter or longer because of the differences about how you're planning and thinking?
So a variation of your question relates to what the role of human scientists is in science now and in the future. Thus far, members of our team have set the objective function for every one of those like world record endeavors inside of Lila. And effectively, the AI is directing the search function that Nemo described, with greater than human level capacity to be able to predict a sensational hypothesis that will succeed, design a decisive experiment, interpret the results, and proceed. When I describe that science is going to get way more fun, I kind of feel like we scientists walk in through a door that has like a doormat and a banner that says like awe or wonder, and that door then slams, and then we're handed either pipettes to move fluids around or oven mitts, depending on whether you're in life or material science. And the number of intention, curiosity, or imaginative loops that you can run to ground, is low. Sometimes one per year can be a laudable success. So those are going to increase, and scientists will get to use, our higher level capacity for imagination and dreaming. But over time, AI models are going to become very good at those also. We recently added Ken Stanley, who wrote a book that has been really influential to the way that I think about innovation. It's called Why Greatness Cannot Be Planned. And effectively, he describes why grant review processes and other heuristics sort of orient the vector of research and innovation towards what is already known and to remain trapped by our current conceptual schemes, when what is most fruitful for greatness is the inverse, like sort of tasteful journey outside of the current conceptual schemes of how the world works. And he's endeavoring to give AI models the imagination and taste for what important novelty looks like. And that category is not well tested in AI models today. They are voraciously tested with book smart heuristics, but the one that is going to move civilization forward is likely, residing in imagination instead of just reasoning, or, in addition to. So, as to what Lila Science looks like next year and each ensuing year, our primary goal is to maximally increase our scientific intelligence with every single month, quarter, and year, so as to make it more and more fun and productive to be a scientist inside.
I love the way you frame it, that the sort of, in a way, what we have, the route we've taken through the world, and the point you make about the bitter lesson is essentially we're finding possibly kind of local minima in everything that are a result of the biological constraints that we've been given because of evolution and whatever. I mean, a great example Jan LeCun uses is, with AI, we should be thinking about building like the wing of an F-16 is the way to think about it. Even though albatrosses do a great job of having a great wing and they fly well and whatever, it's just like they do the best they could have given the constraints and maybe given their objective function. Whereas with material science and AI is like that. You can go so far beyond what nature could have done because nature can never fly at Mach 3 or whatever they fly. So, but to your point that these things, and an extrapolation of that line of thinking is that these things are already and will totally learn languages and objective functions, etc., and capabilities that we don't have at all or can even imagine. So knowing that, how do you get things on a path that is ultimately beneficial for humanity? Again, I don't want to invoke the whole paperclip argument, but I think in your world, it's maybe more important than ever, right? That because you're pairing the real world with AI, with scientific superintelligence. So it's like, and in these lab experimentations,
leave aside beneficial for humanity for a second. How about beneficial to Lila? Like ultimately, like if I look at kind of like the Lila model and kind of what you're going after, I think the hardest bit maybe is not building the factories, but then lining up the factories against an external commercialization window or partner or like handover in an efficient way such that you can reinvest in the platform, And so,
Ooh, okay.
Yes.
There's three awesome questions there. One is, how does the life of scientists change? Two is safety. Three, Brett, I'd extract that to be, and how do you make money?
Yeah, sure.
Let me try to take all three of those. So, a member of our founding team, for many years, he and I have been in dialogue about the experience that chess players went through with the ascent of AI. His name is Josh Waitzkin. If you all know the movie and book Searching for Bobby Fischer, he was that boy in real life, reigning chess champion in his age group for 10 years in a row as a child, quit, and then of all things took up martial arts, became a world champion. And for 20 years, he's been considering deeply, what are the things that distinguish people from being good, great, or the best in the world in a given domain? But, he saw his life's obsession obliterated with the ascent of superintelligence in chess. And, as he would try to transmit to other people what that feels like, based on the perspective that will happen to other domains too, it's amazing, how our hubris stands in the way of believing that the same will be true. I think all of us are better off believing it to be factual, that the same will be true for every human domain. And the reason that's inspiring, and I think not threatening in science, is that the role of science is not to repeat what we've done in the past. it is to reach into the future and try to grab technologies that are a second away, 10 minutes away, or 1,000 years away. Like the status quo rate of advancement in chess meant that AI models might have pulled a few thousand years of advances into the present. And, chunks of that kind in science and technology will be extraordinary. And along the way, we'll go from having to sit in prolonged cognitive dissonance and like a decade-long attention span to a specific reductionist question to the best scientists being the ones that can rapidly update their mental models and realize that 20 years ago, a filter crept in that was erroneous so as to try to keep up with and not pass on, our errors to machines. The second is safety, and doing this ethically, responsibly, and safety is extremely important to us. And we believe it is one of the reasons that this is so important to do in the first place, is that there are a lot of non-AI scary things that can happen in science. And we are going to need powerful systems to be able to better defend ourselves in the future. And there are many ways in which having a closed loop in the lab amends itself to safety approaches because of the simple mass balance on the lab and the multiple points of observation and intervention that can make this paradigm safer than AI models being released into the public domain. And pioneering those approaches and technologies is a part of our mission. On Brett's, and how do you make money? I'll start with a humorous observation, which might actually be the right vantage point from which to think about this. So the estimated IQ of chimpanzees is 25. The IQ of humans is 100-ish. And we don't have any reason to believe that delta of scientific intelligence above us will be limited to a unit smaller than that difference. If it's even close, then the implication for the foundation of what all future science sits on is trillions of dollars are going to move onto a new foundation of scientific intelligence. That we believe is more important and more valuable than any given external product. And we don't plan to spend Lila parent equity capital on expensive clinical trials or scaling up our new energy technologies. Instead, we hope to do those with many partners over time and voraciously invest our attention into increasing our scientific intelligence.
I was just kind of curious, on the going back on the Brett question about making the money. To me, how I'm thinking about Lila is really, there's kind of emerging capabilities which you're achieving because you're doing across the science and with the science super intelligence. And that really enables you to go for much more for disruptive kind of innovation versus sustained innovation across the different fields. And that's the kind of first layer. And then, second layer, how I see, and maybe this is very far in the future, but kind of, like now today on Instagram, everyone is a creator. Is there a future where we live that everyone is a scientific creator on Lila's or other platforms? And, it's disruptive innovation is the norm and reality modus operandi and not the sustained one.
One of the challenges that has come along with the last century in particular of scientific progress is the extreme level of narrow reductionism and specialization, such that fields have become sub-fields. And many of the brilliant practitioners within a given subfield could brilliantly participate beyond that domain. However, it's difficult to get funding to do that. One has to access facilities that are distinct, depending on how divergent that is from one's baseline. And this paradigm has the potential to really dissolve a lot of those barriers and allow, a form of higher intelligence to accrue simply from highly cross-disciplinary and, boundaryless human imagination and creative contributions to the wheel of science. Oh, your point on disruption, completely agree in that investing in the wheel itself allows you to be, focused on humankind's greatest challenges and not just, short putts for where, science can deliver value.
And it's related to the, like, as you narrowly specialize, one, it's kind of like you have to be, like you said, the grant making process necessarily pushes you towards conservatism in terms of what you're trying to do. And whatever the inefficiencies of that specialization relative, like you don't have time to read the papers in the other field, right? Because you're having to go down this little narrow channel. And so there are almost certainly kind of like these inefficiencies that once you explore that space, there are big like step change advances available there. It's just there's not a set of tooling or an incentive structure that allows people to make those lateral moves. I mean, that's kind of what Lila's promising to provide.
Yeah, and all of us have had the experience of talking to a non-expert and realizing how their algorithm to find the root node is often much more sophisticated, than those of us that have been in a domain for a long time, simply because we amass a composite of fact and assumption. And, people from another domain can start with the seemingly simple questions, but which often blow through categories of assumptions that we've taken for granted.
How do you think about decentralized science as the movement? And I know there are some private companies which kind of are trying to kind of use the blockchain as a technology to kind of enable decentralized science. And how does the Lila kind of plays in that ecosystem?
I'll give a couple of perspectives. One is one of the things that we think is critical to solve that has thematic overlap is the, if you will, sort of broken token stream of scientific hypothesis to experimental protocol to raw data to interpretation of data. What gets published is a meaningful downfiltration from that. And even what gets recorded in the lab is an immense contraction of that. And open science, open source movements, and the detail with which, we're trying to create AI science factories that are effectively manufacturing unknown tokens in science, have a lot of similarity of filling in those gaps and making it so that something that takes place on a Tuesday in Nebraska, and a Thursday in Germany, can be compared to one another, or even a Tuesday in Nebraska versus a Thursday in Nebraska. There's a lot of holes in the way that we conduct and communicate science today that I think this next phase is going to fill in.
There's a famous and possibly apocryphal quote. I think it's Charles Duell, however you say it, from the 1899. He was a patent commissioner who said, the famous, everything that can be invented has already been invented by now. Clearly that wasn't right then. And, I think many would argue, hopefully we all would argue that that's not the case now. And I think you share that. Now, if you were to build like some mechanism, let's say for sort of a relative innovation unit, right, that might take into account something like how different is something that's being invented from what went before? How useful is it in some whatever utility function? And maybe you throw in some other dimensions. But if we just say that relative innovation unit of whatever kind, is it your best bet? I think we would probably argue that since, say, 1899, there's probably been at least a linear, if not maybe an exponential continuation and growth of that relative innovation unit, as it were. What do you see going forward? Does that begin to tail off eventually? Or does it continue somewhat linearly, if you even agree that it is linear since that time? Or does it actually hit an exponential on the upside?
Ooh, I love the questions that y'all ask. If you were to back up and observe the totality of human science, what makes this moment distinct is the possibility that intelligence is going to go up. And if true, then, looking at that long timeline of human scientific and technological advancement, if you squint, that has been the engine of largest contribution to GDP evolution across human civilization. And I don't see any reason to believe that with intelligence going up, that the contribution of science to GDP will tail off. The phenomena en route to determinism is a sufficiently miraculous societal state that it's almost irrelevant. Like, what matters is, what is science going to be able to do over the course of the next decade? And the answer in my mind is squarely on the exponential side of that. That the reason I jumped to the humans v animal kingdom scientific comparison is that that's the last intelligence revolution of consequence to science. Every technology revolution since has been just that. It has not altered the fundamental intelligence with which science is advanced.
Well, I mean, I don't know, inventing writing, probably, like, being able to store and transmit information to other people. And so then kind of onboarding everybody to at least a common kind of like understanding platform, also meaningful. And I think that there's like a tool, a platform that basically like generates scientific revolutions, as opposed to having us wade through all of the kind of like current incentive structure in science that in some ways holds back scientific revolutions. I would imagine it should trigger and spur and catalyze like a faster rate of scientific advance. What do you think about? Do you think so? You can imagine there's an Elon Musk view of the world, and we're strong proponents for Elon and his businesses, that kind of the science or really his is like just an engineering approach, but there's a lot of science that has to go on in his organizations to create the engineering artifacts that are remarkably valuable. And so, it's clear, like he has a similar philosophy of like, you need to actually do experimentation. You need to do wide scale experimentation to like actually build the artifacts that work, and you need to fail a lot. His kind of business strategy is I'm piercing all the way through vertical integration into commercialization on these advances and the engineering artifacts that we build. Whereas kind of clearly Lila is aligning itself as like, we're going to get something to a certain point and then going to like try to pass it off or monetize it at that point, because you don't want to spend time, energy, and equity on what is necessarily like a narrow commercialization path rather than building the broader platform. Do you think that will always be kind of optimum strategy? Do you think that in different fields it will look different? Like, is your marginal dollar always going to be on an AI scientist or a roboticist, or will it be on like, I need a business development person in each of these fields to like make this whole thing work?
So let me describe quickly the modes of commercialization that we will pursue. One is large partners being on the platform. Another is external startups being on the platform. Another is us spinning out a company to pursue a specific vertical pursuit of a disruptive technology. We expect all of those to be a part of Lila's model. I'll now jump to a continuum of strategies. One being that every marginal dollar is invested only on the basis of the consumer demand and commercial traction of any given platform. That's been an appropriate heuristic for building almost any company thus far. The other side of the continuum would be zero emphasis on revenue, because winning scientific superintelligence is so valuable, and accompanying that, zero emphasis on customers. That, of course, would not have been a wise strategy at any point in the past, but in light of intelligence ascending, is a valid strategy now. The Lila strategy is closer to that second scenario. Like, we do not want to be having a Michelin restaurant cook, like Whoppers based on current conceptual schemes as to what one should outsource in science. But we are going to have some meaningful relationships with initially small number of entities that can access the platform in a privileged way, so that we can, with less distraction, aggressively pursue the one wheel of science that achieves and leads scientific superintelligence. And over time, we're going to be opening more and more doors for the external world to be on the Lila platform, akin to what Nemo was describing earlier, of like people in any location being able to access it. And one of the things that's important about that strategy is the simple, I believe, fact, or let's call it a hypothesis, that no one's going to want to be on a lower intelligence scientific platform. Just like one wouldn't have wanted to be the patent examiner that was in the booth next to Einstein thinking about physics. Nobody's going to want to use GPT-2, instead of 3, 4, etc., in terms of the brilliance with which, science is advancing.
Would the business model be something like, hey, you access this platform and then we get some kind of like ownership or royalty or equity stake in any insights that you develop off of it, but then you're empowering that person to come to some insight and then they carry it on with you capturing a piece of that? Is that the way to think about it?
Yeah. Simplistically, if you look at the capital inputs to science, the world spends hundreds of billions of dollars on research across the domains of life, chemistry, and physical sciences. If intelligence goes up, that number goes up, and get the paradigms change. And then there are trillions of dollars of end products which sit on a foundation of science, which have varying times to commercialization. We expect Lila to participate in both. The further off a revenue source is, the lower the relative priority to us. From the simple vantage point that if you're long scientific superintelligence, you should be focused on near-term revenue sources that support that pursuit.
Jeff, quick related question. I mean, you've already been a very successful entrepreneur in a number of ways and have built unicorn companies, and you've done a lot of thinking about this. For some of the younger, earlier career, maybe first company entrepreneurs in the audience, how do you think about, maybe it's hopefully a brief question, sorry, the way of weighing, do you have is it just heuristic or like a spidey sense of how you look at new opportunities, especially as you're bearing in mind the sort of focus versus risk hedging in these deep tech plays? We all know the examples of biotech or other companies in deep tech that have been saved by their plan B or C, right? There's loads of examples, whereas generally we hear you need to focus on plan A. How does one possibly handle that kind of cognitive dissonance as you look at different opportunity sets and try and knock things out of the park? Any words of wisdom on that? Always useful for people.
Yeah, I think the rules are in the midst of changing so substantially that I'll reserve the right to evolve the answer to this enormously over the next few years.
Hedging the question on hedging. It's perfect.
But I'll take you back in time first. So when I was finishing up grad school, I'd had the taste of getting involved in a couple of startups, and I just loved it. Like the rate of learning, the extreme trust and partnership with other people, the fact that the stuff I was working on was at death's door all the time. Those were beautiful. And I started to imagine that if science was going to go up and to the right, then almost by definition, if that transition is swift, the most valuable and impactful companies have not yet been started. For the same reason that the trillion-dollar companies, aren't named Bell Labs, or the companies in a couple secessions of technology prior. It tends to be the new seedlings that take advantage of a burst of nutrient source that, wasn't available before. So the things that get me most excited that I would advise to others are these insights where, if it's right, the rules change in ways that apply to thousands of products, or like whole chunks of the world as we currently define it. And oftentimes we aren't looking there, as people. Like we're sort of looking at some distal node in a tree of assumptions, and finding that hidden node, which to the expert, may have been solidified 20 years ago, is the search process that entrepreneurs should go through. Second piece of advice is, sometimes the test time compute that's applied by entrepreneurial people is woefully inadequate. Like where they've trained their biological foundation model, and then like first spark of, hey, we should start a company around this, they go and do that, not realizing that, a decade of time is going to be dedicated to it. And we don't get very many of those, at least in biology as we know it thus far. And then now there are going to be scale benefits to intelligence that I think change the rules in ways that the sort of appropriate heuristic of the past, that startups only succeed by being extremely focused, will be true and false. Like true in that human teams have difficulty executing without focus, but false in that the most interesting capabilities of AI are going to have a breadth that surpasses our capabilities.
Last question from me, and then we may need to wrap up shortly, but maybe it looks like Brett may have a couple of others. If you cast your mind forward a decade and you look back and say, what is the single thing that happened as a result of Lila existing? What is the moonshot or knock it out of the park dream? What is the biggest single stride forward that you can envisage could have happened from Lila and would be the biggest outcome, biggest win for you?
Let me qualify that. Do like a half decade first, then do a decade.
Well, both of them connect to the mission. Like our mission is scientific superintelligence to solve humankind's greatest challenges. So the half decade is incontrovertible increase in intelligence in science, measured in the only way that actually matters at the end of the day, which is, can these models reach into the future further than the human mind has been capable of, so as to pull technologies into the present? And then a decade from now is a really long time. It's hard to make 2-year plans. So I think a decade from now, science will be difficult to recognize. And one of the reasons to be bullish on superintelligence in science is AI models are already super intelligent at specific tasks in science to a degree that is astonishing. Like AlphaFold could be thought of as a very narrow, but scientifically very important and valuable form of superintelligence in understanding how these beautiful noodles we call proteins become, the shapes that manifest as the engines of life. The models that we've created inside of Lila to be able to design new categories of materials and biomolecules could be thought of similarly. And those will become broader and more comprehensive. And so well before either of those timelines, my open belief is that this beautiful mind that we're trying to build inside of Lila is a polymath and savant like we haven't seen before across the breadth of science.
Do you think in a decade, like we today talk, it's a creator economy? In a decade, it's going to be a science economy that we're going to be living?
Simplistically, I have no idea, but I like that concept.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that there is reason to believe. Like there's a reason that we're interested in and invested in Lila. It's because this is the bottom of a big pyramid of really like what makes humans life as good as it is today is kind of scientific discovery. And so if you can accelerate that rate, it creates huge amounts of downstream value, like tremendous trillions, tens of trillions. And so, building the engine that expands that bottom of the pyramid more quickly is a really interesting business, like human-centric and potential kind of like business value creation spot to be. So we're really pleased to be going along with the journey with you and really think Lila is a provocatively positioned company with lots to look forward to ahead.
Final question. Why is it called Lila?
So 2 points of inspiration. One is there's a Sanskrit term, Lila, which means divine play. And that seemed like a more elegant parsing of the self-play paradigm that Lila is enabling for science, which, is the means by which superintelligence was achieved in chess, Go, and other games. The second is there's a philosopher, Robert Pirsig, who writes about the concept of Lila defined as dynamic quality, which in his parsing is the frontier in which static or existing realms of knowledge are transformed into the unknown, right at that edge between the two. And, accompanying that, the process of discovery and pursuit of what's new. So both of those really resonated with our founding crew.
Well, Jeff, thanks so much for coming on the FYI podcast. We look forward to enjoying the fruits of Lila's scientific labors and seeing the acceleration in the rate of scientific discovery. And I'm sure we'll, speak with you again, and best of luck with a lot of execution to come.
Cool. Thank you all. And if anybody listening is a brilliant AI scientist or scientific mind, we are growing the team rapidly. And this is the most inspiring frontier for all of intelligence, in our view. So, give us a holler if you're compelled by the mission.
Great. From ARK Invest, that was FYI, the For Your Innovation podcast. Please subscribe on the podcasting platform of your choice. Tell your friends and family so that more people can listen and we can continue to make great podcasts. I found the conversation with Jeff to be quite inspiring. I think it'll be really interesting to see how the company develops and how it develops those commercial interfaces with the outside world. I do think that it's obvious, given the cost performance advances we see in AI, that AI will change the way in which knowledge work happens. And scientific knowledge work, really the pure science, is actually the baseline on which all additional innovation is built. And so in some ways, Lila could be kind of the bottommost innovation platform on top of which everything else occurs. It'll be really a fascinating couple years and half decade for that company and the way in which Jeff is trying to drive it forward. Thank you much for joining, and please join us next week.
ARK believes that the information presented is accurate and was obtained from sources that ARK believes to be reliable. However, ARK does not guarantee the accuracy or completeness of any information, and such information may be subject to change without notice from ARK. Historical results are not indications of future results. Certain of the statements contained in this podcast may be statements of future expectations and other forward-looking statements that are based on ARK's current views and assumptions, and involve known and unknown risks and uncertainties that could cause actual results, performance, or events to differ materially from those expressed or implied in such statements.